Hey, all you deep divers and dolphins. Welcome to The Aquatic Life, a podcast about underwater photography, diving, and adventure travel. I'm Todd Reimer, and with me, as always, is Dalton Hamm.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
We're looking forward to bringing you another in our series of Getting Started. This time it's going to be post-processing basics for those that are new to that. But before we get into that, let's bring us up on what we've been doing. Corona Watch week 4, I think, or maybe 6. I can't even keep my days straight, much less my weeks. So what have you been doing to stay sane, Dalton, besides watching Tiger King?
I don't think I have been staying sane, bud. It's starting to get to me, being stuck inside. We're not inside people. I did some work on my Jeep, put a new bumper and winch on, working on some content for the YouTube channel. I think that's pretty much all I've been doing this past week. How about you?
Right on. In addition to getting the site and social media sites are officially live, our podcasts, as of the recording, have just launched. So the first 3 episodes launched. So just a matter of making the official announcement, getting friends and family on board, and making sure we start building an audience. The other thing, I guess, the big thing I got to do was wash my car. I guess that's a good thing. As you know, I'm big into auto detailing, so I got to give a nice long hand wash and wax. So if anyone else is looking for a hobby to do while they're stuck at home, maybe check out the Reddit group of auto detailing. There's definitely a lot of fun rabbit holes to get into, and that's what I've been doing the last couple of days, is working on the car. Right on.
When you're done, you can come clean mine.
Well, you got a Jeep, isn't it supposed to be better off looking dirty than clean? I think I'd get in trouble. I think I'd get in trouble for cleaning up your Jeep.
Right? I think it still has mud on it from pre-coronavirus.
Yeah. Why don't we just get into it and talk about post-processing basics. The idea for this episode is, in my travels and experience with other divers on dive trips, new underwater photographers fall into one of 2 categories for me. One are people like you and I, where we had experience with taking photos on land already. So we're used to work. Once we have photos, we know what to do with them. We know how to post-process them, organize them, all that other stuff. But the bigger group, in my experience, is really people that they got certified, they love diving, and then they see all this amazing sea life, and they're like, man, I need to get pictures of all this. And so then they start down the rabbit hole that way, but they don't have the background of photography basics, and we can go in many different ways with that, of course. But today I just wanted to concentrate on, the basics of what do I do with, I got my camera, whether it's a GoPro or point and shoot. I just started. If you listen to a past episode, we can talk about that. What am I supposed to do with it now that I have this memory card full of photos? So what about you? What's your experience been? Has it been the same as mine in terms of the other folks that have you met that are new photographers?
For the most part, it's people with either A, too much money, or B, are really excited to get into just capturing their adventures underwater. They're not necessarily looking to sell the next, cover of National Geographic or Sport Diver or anything like that. They just want to get their photos from their camera to their computer and maybe share some things on Instagram or Facebook or something like that. That being said, I think that there's 2 schools of thought on shooting at that point. I think that most of us, especially at the level that we're at, is you only shoot raw, and then things go into Lightroom, Photoshop, things like that, and you do some editing to your photos and clean them up and whatnot. But for a good group of people, I don't think it's even going to be that in depth. I just think it's a matter of giving them a good organizational system. And whether they're on a Mac, they can use iPhotos or Photos for the PC. I don't know what the PC equivalent is, but I know they have some little photo organization app, something like that. And then I wouldn't necessarily recommend that they probably going to get a lot of feedback on this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that they shoot raw out of the gate. Because if you're not going to do any editing to your photos, raw really isn't where you want to be shooting. You want to shoot JPEG. That way it's giving kind of a finished look. What you see on the back of your camera when you take the picture, that's what you're going to get at the end of the day. Which is fine if all you're doing is just wanting to, what's the word I'm looking for? You just want to capture your dive, and you're really not going to do a lot with it.
Just to jump on your point to elaborate, when you shoot JPEG, what happens in camera is you have raw is a very, it has the whole color spectrum. So your images look really flat. So your camera basically applies a filter to it to make the colors pop and stand out. And then if you save it in JPEG, you have that filter already pre-applied. You don't have to do anything with it. Whereas if you shoot raw, you get your complete color spectrum, your complete range, but the image isn't going to look great to start. You actually have to work it.
Right. So raw, it retains all the data that was taken in by the camera when the shutter was fired. So all that information is there. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to throw that in there. So keep going on with your thought though. So you're recommending that for beginners, in some circumstances, they may want to start just shooting JPEG in those cases and not necessarily shoot raw.
Yeah. I would just, if they're just starting out and they're just wanting to catalog their dive, and say, hey, look what I saw, then shoot JPEG. It'll give you a little bit of latitude if you decide to edit it later, but you're going to have something out of the gate to start with, and you're not going to have to take it into a post-processing program and spend time editing your photos. I know that's not something for everyone. Once you realize that you can get a lot better photo by shooting raw, you'll probably end up going down that rabbit hole. But to start out with, if you want to shoot what your end purpose is.
Let me jump in and also say, I think also the type of dive that you're doing will also dictate how easy it is to basically rely on JPEG only. If you're diving on sunny days in shallow water that's clear, the white balance is going to be much less of an issue. If your white balance is less likely to be off on that dive, and JPEG is most likely you're more likely to get it correct and not need that much adjustment on, versus if you do a dive in more complicated situations, the likelihood of having to do additional processing where you're going to need to rely on larger white balance adjustments, depending on the type of photos that you're choosing, the more likely that raw will come and save a lot of photos that JPEG won't be able to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of power in shooting raw. You get, like I said, it retains all the data. And JPEG doesn't. Whatever it needs to make that image that's on the back of the screen of your camera, whatever it needs to make that image, that's the data it'll save. Everything else gets discarded. Where with raw, all the data gets saved. That being said, though, that will probably be a topic for another podcast, because I got a feeling it could be a doozy.
Yeah, I think there's definitely debate. I think it's good to throw in some controversial comments on there, depending on who's listening. It'll help the discussion boards going on. But you know what? If you want to bridge the gap and do both, most cameras let you shoot raw plus JPEG, so you can get them both. Where Dalton's definitely going with this point is one of the first times new photographers start using a photo processing software and they bring the raw images in, they get shocked that the image on the back of the screen that they see, that it looks completely different and much more bland and quote unquote yucky compared to what they saw on the back of the screen, and they don't know what happened. Well, the camera applied the filter, and now you're looking at the raw image with nothing applied, so you have to do all the work.
And there are presets you can do in each of those software applications that can, so when you import it, it can look closer to what you saw on the back of the camera and give you that as a starting point. But I think the biggest thing is probably just to give some people some ideas of what they can do and applications and programs they can use.
Yep. So I think what I think we should handle is first talk about what's out there. You know, they have photos. What are their options? You already alluded to some of them, but let's kind of talk about each of them from quickly at a high level. What are their free options? What are their low cost options, and what are their subscription options? And then talk very quickly about, okay, that's great. They've chosen what they want to do. What do they do with the photos? What is the really high level workflow of what they should be doing? Having said that, Dalton, you and I both use Adobe. We have a Creative Cloud subscription that gives us both a program called Lightroom and Photoshop for about $10 a month. And Lightroom is the main software that basically does all of our cataloging, all of the major edits that we would do to a photo, cropping, and even printing, and lots of other stuff. It's pretty powerful software that we primarily work in Photoshop that we'll talk about some other time, but that comes along with the description. What other options are there other than what we're using?
Well, there's other programs that we still use, but we use them as plugins, like Luminar.
Yep.
So Skylum has Luminar, which is a phenomenal program. A lot of people use it as a plugin, but it's also a standalone application. So you can use it as a raw editor as well. There's, if we're talking paid, so there's Lightroom, Luminar, Capture One. On One has a application called Photo Raw, which is again similar to Luminar. I used to use that a lot for retouching of fashion images and things like that. Doing skin, it had a really good skin editing software, and they combined everything into a Luminar style, and it's called On One Photo Raw. I think for PC, a lot of people are familiar with Corel Paint Shop Pro, and I think that's going to top out the most of the paid and really worth using.
Yeah. And so we're talking about anywhere
software
from $50 to 100 something for the paid one-time fee for paid software options that you mentioned. I don't remember what Luminar is going for nowadays, but I think they usually are about $100 or something.
Like $100.
Yep. Yeah. But the next thing is there are a lot of free options out there as well. Dalton and I neither of us are expert out there, but there's GIMP is a popular one. Darktable I haven't used, but looks really cool. It looks like very much like Lightroom. It seems to have a lot of metadata and a good way of laying things out. And we'll include in our show notes what we can find for some free options for you guys to look into. And if you happen to be on Mac, well, then your Photos app will be available for you to download your photos into there too. And you've got a lot of similar ways of cataloging and doing basic tweaks that you do in Lightroom. But if you're on PC, there's lots of freeware out there as well.
Yeah, and there's online based stuff. I think it's called Pixlr or something like that. I remember seeing quite a few. I don't keep up with them, so it's hard to do, but
yeah, we're obviously big fans because we use a lot of Adobe's other products, and we use Photoshop a lot for things not just for underwater photography, but for other applications or other creative processes as well. So it's a no-brainer for us to use Lightroom and Photoshop, and for $10 a month, you can't go wrong for us. So we're big fans of it, but the thing is, there are lots and lots of options, and they all do the same basic things. It lets you import your raw photos and do basic editing to where you can get the color to where you need to be, do your cropping, and do cataloging. You know, pick your photos that you want to work on and reject the ones that you don't. Most of the software programs out here will let you go through all of that stuff.
I think what I would recommend most people starting off, even if it is the Adobe photo package of Lightroom and Photoshop. I wouldn't necessarily recommend jumping into the Photoshop deep end right away, because Lightroom can do, I would say, at least 80% of the heavy lifting.
I would say 90%.
Or 90% of the heavy lifting.
I'd say they're 90% there, Chuck.
Yeah, I would too. I mean, I usually don't go into Photoshop unless I'm doing some cloning or some really heavy lifting, so to speak, in the raw file. But so with that being said, you could use Lightroom for a monthly fee. You could buy Luminar just to get started, and then graduate into Lightroom and Photoshop a little later if that's what it is. For me though, with what makes it so easy with Lightroom, Luminar, Capture One, all of those guys, is that you get a bunch of sliders down the side, and they have a name on them: shadows, highlights, contrast, exposure, whites, blacks, and you just slide them plus or minus, and you can slide it all the way to one end, see what it does, all the way to the other one, see what it does, and then slide it back somewhere in the middle till you find, so it makes it easy. Just to visually look at your photos, where in Photoshop, it takes a little bit more to get into that without opening Camera Raw itself.
Yep, I totally agree. So. Definitely don't want to start in Photoshop for many, many reasons. Definitely want to look for any Adobe product. Even I don't know if they may even have standalone version of Lightroom only, but regardless, we'll put in our show notes all the options that we talked about and whatever else we can find in the meantime. But you want to have some sort of software that you can basically review your photos and do some tweaking on those images. Even JPEGs, even if you shot JPEG only, as Dalton mentioned earlier, you can still use the same tools to further tweak them. You just have less information, but you can still increase the contrast, highlights, and shadows. Yep. So you can do this work whether you shoot JPEG or RAW. Not a problem.
I would say, yeah. So if you start out shooting, JPEG, just so you have a finished file to, start with and show people, and you can always go back to that file later in Lightroom or Capture One or Luminar, whichever one you choose to go with, and you can still tweak that file. You just don't have the same latitude that you would have if you had the raw file. So yeah, it just because you shoot JPEG in the beginning doesn't mean that you're not able to do anything with those photos later.
Very good point. So our new underwater photographer got their camera. They now know they've got to have some sort of software to work on them, work on the photos. They've gone for a dive and they've got their memory card out of their camera. They're ready to actually do something. Let's kind of walk from there and talk about, as you'll hear people talk about, workflow. Basically, this is the process. The idea is start to finish. Once I'm done shooting, what do I actually do with my photos? And usually you have a standard order of how you work them. Now, as a new photographer, it doesn't need to be sort of formal, but I will argue that there's certain steps that you want to make sure to do religiously first, regardless of whether you're a beginner or professional. The first thing is you have your data on your memory card. You got to make sure to basically get your data off your memory card and have a backup of it.
Absolutely.
Part of the thing that we're doing here is cataloging. So one of the things is we're going to import it into whatever software you've chosen, and it's going to be uploaded. Now, you can stick your memory card back in your camera and clear them out. That's great. But now that means you only have one version of a photo and it's sitting on your computer. And what happens if something goes wrong with your computer, or you accidentally delete it, or someone doesn't like you and they throw the whole thing overboard? You want to make sure to have a second copy somewhere.
Absolutely. I mean, usually my workflow, usually I get out of the water for the day and I'll transfer photos onto a portable hard drive. I have a lovely little terabyte portable hard drive. Actually, I've got a few different ones, but this by SanDisk, they make a very thin, very elegant little portable 1 terabyte hard drive that you can plug into your computer I transfer pictures to that and then to my computer. So I have something that I can give to either you or my wife or whoever is on the dive trip when we're traveling back home. That way there's multiple copies of of my photos for that trip in different places. And I'll also use Backblaze or some other cloud-based server to back photos up. Up to. So that now I have them in 3 places, and I know I'm never going to lose them.
Yep. And I do something similar. So as soon as the memory card comes out, it gets saved off, one to the computer into whatever software I'm doing, and then the second copy goes to either a thumb drive or an external hard drive. And then that way you've freed your memory card to go back in the camera if you want. If you happen to have extras, then leave that memory card in the back and put a new one in. That way you happen to have an extra one just in case. But so long as you at least have your files in 2 spaces outside of that memory card that you took out, you should be in good shape. But that should be one of the first things you do is make sure you have 2 copies, one on your computer, one on a separate external device, just to be safe.
Yep. And, like Todd was saying with memory cards so cheap these days, I think I've got a dozen different SD cards and then half a dozen or so XQD cards. So when I dive, I just put a new memory card in my camera each time, and then when I get home, I'll delete them. Once I know I have all my photos back home.
Better safe than sorry, right?
Exactly. It might sound a little bit like overkill, but I mean, how many of us have lost one image and been like really bummed out by it? Much less, if you're shooting professionally and you have client images that you have to that you're having to take care of, then you're talking money at that point.
Yep. Yeah, and it's just so easy to do. Otherwise, it literally takes 5 minutes to do this one extra step, and you've got peace of mind. That way, if something, God forbid, ever happens to your camera housing floods, or something gets stolen and it happens to have the memory card in it. I've had that experience where I could care less about the camera, but the memory card that was in there, I'm like, oh, I know I had this shot, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's why you want to make sure to take out and be able to back up your images on a regular basis and have in multiple cases, because you're going to care more about what's on the data on the camera versus the actual camera, because camera's replaceable and images are not. Even though it's more expensive, technically, it's will mean more to you to have the actual images.
Absolutely. I mean, you're talking about something that's replaceable versus something that's not. Like the dive that we did on the Vandenberg down in the Keys, when my housing flooded, the images that I took that whole day were gone. It was our last dive of the day. My housing flooded due to a manufacturer issue, and all those photos were gone for the day, and nothing I can do about it. So yeah, it's not something you want to have to deal with if you can help it.
And maybe let's take a step even further back, even though that wasn't the official topic for today, but it kind of goes back to, if you're on a long dive trip over several days, there's always the debate over how often you go in to take your camera, take memory cards out of your camera, because you have to open up your housing again if you're dealing with a bigger housing, versus you want to touch it as little as possible. Since we are kind of talking about getting started, let's not get in there, because we'll just assume that they're on smaller housings that are easier to and more mistake resistant than bigger housings. So you want to, at least at the end of each dive day, in general, make sure you pull your memory card out, just in case something happens. You lose the camera, so it gets damaged. That way you have at least your dives from the prior days saved off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just one more with the extra memory cards, with you can get a 32 gig SD card for $15.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's easy to collect those. If you have 7 of them for a 7-day trip, you'll use them, and you've spent $70. We spend that on dinners sometimes.
Exactly.
So especially on dive trips.
Yep. Great point. Okay, so let's jump back. We've made our copy. We've got images. They're in. I'm going to say Lightroom from here on out, but when I do say it, just know that means your photo editor of choice. So we've uploaded images. They're into Lightroom. What do you typically do once you've as your next first step once they're actually uploaded?
So for me, I tend to work a little old school and a little new school mixed together. I have a habit of organizing my photos on the computer before I even bring them into Lightroom.
Okay,
so
good point. Yep.
I do that. So I have a folder structure that I use, and then they all reside in the same spot. And then I'll go into Lightroom, open them up, and add them instead of importing them. That way they stay in the same spot, and I can add them to a collection, which is very similar to the folder structure. And it's, from what I've seen, Luminar and the other editors all operate on the same premise. You can have a folder structure and catalogs. So I'll have things in a collection, and then I'll just go through and I'll start rating images. In the beginning, I make several passes. So I'll go through one pass and it'll just either be keep or get rid of. You know, if it's a blurry photo, I know I'm not keeping it. I just ditch it. If the strobes didn't fire and so it's just a black screen, I get rid of it. You know, so I just go through and I just get rid of those photos that I know I'm not going to keep, that I know they're not winners. And then,
do you typically delete them right away, or just mark them as rejected and leave them for a while, or do you just?
No, I'll delete them.
Okay,
I just kill them because I know. I mean, they're not. The first round I'll kill because they're, like I said, they're blurry images. They're black screens where the strobes didn't fire. They're things that there's no saving them. Yep. You know, there's really nothing that's going to be. They're not going to be useful in any way. And then all my other photos after that. Yeah, I go through and I have a rating system 2 through 5. 1 star is trash, and then 2 through 5, depending on what I think the quality of the photo is. And I'll probably make anywhere from 3 to 5 passes through those photos, going back through and getting more and more picky as I go along, because, you know, there's just, you got to be your own worst critic, you know, especially with photography. You know, it's, I think if you go into it with the attitude of none of them are good enough, you'll be in a good starting spot. I mean, all my photos, I think they're, personally, I'm like, oh man, yeah, this is great. But you have to be a harsh critic to yourself and say, yeah, it's a nice photo, but is the next, say you have 3 photos that are almost identical. We'll use a shark. So you have a black tip reef shark. It's a little further away. It's kind of cool looking, but it's not, it's nice. But then he's a little closer. Yeah, that one's really nice. But then you have one where he does something and there's some gesture in the photo. And so you have 3 very nice shark photos, but there's one that stands out above the other 2. So that one will get marked, you know, as my winner. And then the other 2, I won't throw them out, but I will, you know, just save them, and I won't necessarily work on them.
And I think that's the key there, is by being extra harsh on which photos actually are your winners, you're going to end up saving your time going down long rabbit holes of tweaking and spending all this time post-processing, which you can spend, you know, hours on, only to realize, well, that's not really your best photo anyway, and you just wasted time that you could have been working on other stuff. So it definitely, by doing that, you definitely save yourself a lot of time in the long run. It's definitely good to spend the time to do that and try to figure out what are your real, true handful of winners versus going through and processing all of them only to throw out most of them.
I also have, so once I get done with my selection process, I have a preset that basically is just a general contrast, highlight, reduce the highlights, open up the shadows a little bit, increase the black point. Just a very mild setup that I can apply pretty much to any underwater photo. I have another preset that I can apply to sports photos. And I'll apply that preset to them. And then that brings them into a rough color space of what you would have seen on the back of your camera. And then from there, I'll get more into I'll do one more round and go, okay, yeah, this one really looks better. I'm going to edit this one.
Yep.
Like that.
So then you'll actually start going through and adjust and working on your winners that you've chosen.
Correct.
So let me take a step back because we went through quite a few steps just to, again, for the beginners out there. The first thing, as mentioned, I also do in my workflow a slightly different than Dalton, but it has the same effect, which is you imported, you have your photos are off a memory card, but you want to get them somehow into a folder that is based on your vacation or your photo dive trip. You basically want to have a folder in your directory, both within your software, but more importantly, sitting in a folder somewhere on the hard drive or wherever your main library is that's representative of what your photo shoot is. So let's say you want a trip to the Grand Cayman and you want a dive trip. Well, most of the times, if you're on a Mac and you just by default import everything, it's going to actually save it in photos and then subfolder by date. And so your Grand Cayman trip the last 7 days are going to be over 7 different folders that don't have anything. Instead of that, it's good to make sure you move all the photos that you took into one folder that means something to you. Grand Cayman, January 2020, and you actually import in there. Dalton does this before he even imports it into Lightroom. He moves all of his photos there first. When I get mine, I actually import mine and then take them and then move them into the folder using Lightroom. It's actually slower and less efficient. Dalton's way is actually better, but they both serve the same purpose that once you're in there, you're actually putting them into a physical folder that whether you're using Lightroom or you're switching software, it's physically going to sit in a folder that's called something that means something to you. Grand Cayman 2020, not 2020 01 02 that's filtered 6 file directories below photos. So that's important. That's a good first step.
So basically, just to expand on that a little bit and try to give people a little bit of a visual. So I'll have on my external hard drive, I have an external hard drive that I keep all my photos on. I'll have a folder that says photos. Inside that folder will be a folder that says landscape, one that says sports, one that says travel, one that says diving, one that says commercial. And then within those folders, there is, so you go hard drive, photos, diving. Next folder would be Grand Cayman, January 2020. And then within that, I could have day 1, day 2, day 3 if I wanted, which I usually do because I start to get a little anal at some point. I used to actually go down all the way to this is the dive from the kitty wake.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I stopped doing that because it was getting a little time consuming. But
and
so
you
now,
could also accomplish that via metadata. If you didn't want physical folders, you could tag them. Again, we don't want to go into too many details like that because those are more intermediate and advanced techniques. You don't need to be overwhelmed with those types of things.
Yeah, so just basic organization will help you a lot, like I said. So if you go your hard drive, photos or photography, whatever you want to call the main folder, and then subfolders into genres like landscapes, family, travel, diving, and then so it goes photography, diving, and then the trip.
Makes great sense. We'll also include an example in the show notes, but you get the idea. You have a folder that means something to you, and your photos will live there. Your software knows that they're there already. And then the next step, as Dalton mentioned, same thing, which is it's time to do culling. It's time to go through and do your multiple passes, figuring out which ones are obvious rejects and delete them. I agree. There's no reason saving them, even though hard drive space is cheap. There's no reason to clutter up your folders with photos you will never touch. So go ahead and reject them and delete them. Then take other passes, and that's when Dalton still does a rating system, 1 through 5 star. Most everyone has it. Lightroom also has a flag or pick that you can also use if you don't want to do stars. You just want to pick the ones that are your winners. You can pick those. I tend to switch back and forth between the two.
They also have a color rating system as well.
And then they also have color ratings. So whatever makes sense to your mind, it's all going to be individual. I will say that you're going to have to fight the urge to just find the images that you just like, oh man, this ghost pipefish is really cool. And just, you're going to want to go down the rabbit hole and just start editing. And that it's fine. It happens to all of us that we just find something where we just love and we're blown away and our workflow gets thrown out the window. That's fine, but you'll end up missing out on a lot of stuff and then realize you're just going to start working on them. And you want to get in the habit of just going through these passes, figuring out which ones have the best potential, mark them, put the rest aside, and then go down there. It's a little bit of discipline, but it will save you guys time.
Right. But within each one of these photo editors, like Lightroom and Luminar, you can say you take 6 pictures of a frogfish. You can select all 6, and they have a compare feature where they'll bring them all up on the screen at the same time. And then you can look at them and, depending on what your culling process is, you don't necessarily have to pick the one you like the best. Go through and pick the one that you don't like. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't like the CFan came back in front of him on that one, so I'm going to get rid of that. So by eliminating the ones that you don't like, you end up with the best one overall. You don't have to look at all 6 of them and go, okay, that's the best one. You can look at all 6 of them and go, well, that one's not good because of that. That one's not good because of that. His tail's cut off in that one. His pectoral fin is behind a CFan on that one. Yep. And so dwindle them down by what's wrong with them. And then by default, you're left with the best one.
Yeah. So Lightroom has a compare tool. You select your 6. You basically have a special viewer as you're viewing them, and the ones you don't like, you hit X, and it basically removes it and it makes all the other photos bigger until you get down to the ones that the one that you like are the ones that are definitely your winners, and you choose them. You'll have to look in each of the individual photo tools to see if there's something similar. I'm sure there are. But the point is, if you're diligent about that, you'll save yourself a lot of time, and you'll get to use most of your time working on just the photos that are going to be the ones that you're going to post to Instagram, get printed, send to friends and family, whatever it is. You're not spending all this time
contests.
You enter into contests, all that fun stuff. So it'll take some getting used to, but if you do follow that process, it definitely will get you to the point where you spend most of your time is once you've found those winners, it's now time to start adjusting the ones that you've chosen and start doing those tweaks. So you go with whatever your highest star rating is or the ones that you've picked, and you're ready to go. So Dalton, you already started down this road talking about sliders and such. Again, we can talk and we probably will have additional topics, additional podcasts, and or maybe some videos to release on the details of what we're going to do. You talked about presets, but what are some of the typical things other than you've applied a preset, you've got a good starting point? Even if you don't have a preset, what is someone else going to typically, what are the typical actions you typically do on most of your photos?
Usually it's cropping, rotating to make sure my horizon line's straight, cropping things out that don't need to be in the photo. You want, in sports photography, they say you want peak action, and you want to get rid of anything that doesn't involve that peak action. So you want to get really tight on your subject. So it's similar with underwater photography and landscapes. So you want to fill your frame with your subject and get rid of anything that detracts from that.
Yep.
So anything that takes away from that awesome frogfish, if say your frogfish is on the right side of the image and you have a C-fan that's really bright and colorful on the left side of the image, maybe you crop that C-fan out so it doesn't detract from the frogfish. There's cropping, make sure your horizon line's straight. Bump up the contrast, pull down the highlights, just to add a little clarity, a little vibrance. Yeah.
But I think enough can't be said about the first step that typically is done, which is cropping, right? One of the mantras we mentioned in the earlier episode, which is if you think you're close, get closer, which you can do to a point while you're there trying to get a picture of the sea life, but it's not always possible to do while you're there. So you have the option now. You've got a nice new camera that's 12 to 1,000,000 megapixels. Well, now you get to put those to good use. You can now reframe things, make it look more pleasing, make sure your borders are clean, all by doing intelligent cropping. So much of your photo can be improved by just cropping in to make your main subject larger and making sure, again, concepts like rule of thirds and other photographic concepts are applied where it's in the appropriate place in the photo, all by just drawing a rectangle around and making sure things are, like you said, the horizon straight by just doing that. And it's the easiest thing to do, but it usually makes the largest impact / benefit to your image by working on cropping it.
And if I know all my photos are going to go on Instagram, I'll do a square crop, or I think it's just off square, but so I'll do a square crop portrait, so I'll just do a square crop on everything. And I'm like, okay, that's all my stuff lives on Instagram. So that's what it needs to be. If everything lives on Facebook, I go to whatever crop ratio they use, and use that. Because not everything is going to be the cropping
exactly.
Cropping sometimes will be required.
Yes. One way or the other, it's super important, especially so if you're big into social media, because Facebook's different than Instagram, is different than Twitter, etc. So, crop, try it out, experiment. And that's the nice thing with all these tools is whatever you're cropping, the pixels don't disappear. It's all non-destructive editing. So whatever you do from here on out in this photo editors, you can always go back to your starting point. So you can crop it, you can change the color drastically, and if you don't like everything that you did, you can just start over. It's never actually adjusting your actual photo. That's the whole benefit of most of these editors. Your whole photo is kept intact. It's basically giving the computer additional information on how to tweak it on top of it. It's putting a filter, quote unquote, on top of it to tell it to do all these things to the original image, but never actually touching it.
With the exception of Photoshop.
Right.
Photoshop is destructive.
Yeah.
You can work non-destructively. You can work non-destructively in Photoshop, but it's going to increase your file size exponentially. And not only that, it's going to be a lot of work.
Yes. Again, let's for the sake of today say we've advised people not to start in Photoshop. So that this advice all happens to be don't do anything we're talking about in Photoshop. And then the same rule applies. Everything that we're talking about here, including non-destructive editing, doesn't include Photoshop. Although cropping now in Photoshop, you can choose not to actually crop out to discard the pixels, but you have to make sure that that's on, because normally if you cropped it in Photoshop, it's gone. Bye-bye. So back in Lightroom, cropping was number one. The number two big thing I would do, especially when it comes to wide angle photos, is there's usually for me some white balancing tweaking to do, messing with the color temperature. So you cropped it, you've arranged your horizon lines. The first slider I'm going to look up and say, okay, for me, I'm going to say, okay, what do the blues look like if I, depending on what the subject is, if I warm it up and move the color temperature bar up, or if I make it a little more blue, what looks more natural? And that's why usually it's one of the top sliders on most software up there. So most computer software like Lightroom is set up trying to guess what the typical workflow is. You touch your white balance first, and then you mess with your exposure, and then your contrast, et cetera, et cetera. It's meant for you to work top down. You definitely don't have to, and it doesn't always make sense for everyone. But typically for me, that's what I usually do is I start with white balance, then exposure, contrast, saturation, things like that. Having said that, each photo is different, but the first thing I will almost always do is to look to see if I can get a better crop and alignment.
Yeah, I mean, we'll do another podcast that'll get into how to.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, we could be here for another couple of hours giving instruction on how to edit a photo. I was say, once you're done with your editing process and you get it to where you like, what's your next step, Todd?
You basically need to take the version of photo you just adjusted and you need to export it. So you need to basically have your photo or photos that you've selected and you want to basically be saved off and posted to Instagram. In Lightroom, you'll click your photo. You can go to File, Export, or you can right click it and choose Export. And it'll basically ask you a whole bunch of things about your photo. Do you want to resize it? Such as Instagram, the max resolution is 1084 by 1084 for a standard one. So you may want to downsize it so it's ready to go just to import at that ideal resolution. Or for Facebook, it would be 2048 is the max length now, or 1920. I will have to look it up. Do you know offhand what the Facebook's ideal resolution?
I knew the other day when someone asked me about it.
Yeah. Either way, if you can just leave it at your normal resolution, that's fine. But Facebook will then resample it for you, and Facebook and Instagram, Facebook especially, does a horrible job at it. So better for you to use your software to have it as the ideal resolution for posting than let Facebook do it for you, because it will look much better if Facebook can just say, oh, it's at the ideal resolution, I'm posting it as is, versus let them reprocess it for you, because otherwise you get blurry, really ugly looking photos.
Yeah. So the big thing with Facebook is that it also depends on where you're using it on Facebook.
Yes.
So if you're using it as a header, or if you're using it as a post, or if you're using it as your little circle headshot guy, you know, it just depends on how it's set up. But I think their max size right now for the cover is 1640 by 859. For a standard post, it's 1200 by 620. And we'll put a little cheat sheet up on show notes.
Again, there's so many more avenues to talk about, talking about, selector sharpening, backscatter removal, all sorts of creative things to do. We'll handle those in separate discussions, and or maybe we'll come out with YouTube videos sometime down the line as if the podcast grows to where we have that, enough of an audience that would want to see that and demand that. But in the meantime, I think this is a good high level overview of, if you're just starting out, getting it from out of your camera and up on social media or off to friends. This is kind of give you a nice high level workflow. Anything else that you can think of that we didn't mention?
So once you've decided what your end use is going to be, whether it's printing or putting it on your phone or putting it on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, there are sections of the application that you're using, whether it be Lightroom or Luminar. They'll have a printing section that, very similarly to your photo section, it'll let you adjust your photo to fit, whether it's a 8x10 or whatever. And, if you need it for Lightroom or if you need it for Facebook or Instagram, you can, like Todd said, set your crop, set your pixel size on your export, and there you go.
So, yeah, I think we got to leave it at that. Otherwise, like you said, we'll be here for forever talking about, print services. If you want to print this, we have lots of experience with that and go down that road too. But that's a topic for much, much later down the road. I think this will cover most people getting started. And even if they took their version of their photo and you did want to get something printed, just know if you're sending it off somewhere else to get printed, give them the highest resolution file for them to print. Don't crop it down to whatever is needed for social media. But if nothing else, just know to save your photo off, and then whatever printing service you need to use, just make sure it's the highest resolution and go from there. So yeah, other than that, let us know if you have any other questions, comments, or thoughts on your own on how your workflow is different, I'm sure we have lots of other advanced photographers here. If you guys do things differently, have other software to recommend, or have a different workflow that you think is worth mentioning, leave us some feedback, post it up on our website on the aquaticlifepodcast.com. Email us at feedback@theaquaticlifepodcast.com and let us know your thoughts, and we'll read them in a future episode.
I also think it's good to toss in there that these are basically starting points. You're going to end up finding your own flow. You'll find little tweaks that work for you, and be able to make it your own. And that's kind of the beauty of this, is that Todd's workflow is different from my workflow, who's different from Stephen Frink's workflow, who's different from Alex Mustard's workflow, who's different from Scott Kelby's workflow. So it just, everybody will find their own little thing to make it their own. So just think of all of this as a starting point.
Once you get your photos in and this basic workflow is done, we're all underwater photographers, but a lot of these processes and best practices now apply regardless. And because of that, there's tons and tons of discussion topics out there, YouTube videos, blog posts to read, and it'll all apply to you and your photos and your workflow too. And getting ideas and inspiration from other people don't necessarily just have to be related to underwater photographers. You'll find lots and lots of ideas all throughout the photography community. So definitely research out there and see, as you're figuring out which photo tool that you did. They don't have to be in underwater photography to learn how to use GIMP or whatever you happen to choose. Once you have the basic idea and the photos are in there, most of what we're talking about isn't the actual adjustments. They're doing everything else. So see what else you can find out there. There'll be lots and lots of information out there for you to use. So I think that'll wrap it up for today. As mentioned before, let us know your thoughts, comments, feedback. We'd love to hear about it. You can even send us, if you want to do an audio, send us an audio file of your thoughts. We'll be happy to play it on the air. Otherwise, just email us or post a comment. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. So I think that does it, Dalton. Thanks for talking about this fun topic with me, and hopefully it engaged some of our newer photographers and gave them some inspiration on where to start.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun.
So if you like what you're hearing, please take a moment to rate us on iTunes and subscribe to get all the latest episodes as soon as they come out. Everyone, stay safe out there, stay sane, and look for us next week.
See ya.